Audiobook title, Against the Ice, The Epics, Survival of the Endurance. Chapter 1, The Dream of the South. The year was 1914. The world was on the brink of a devastating global war, but for the Anglo-Irish explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, his eyes were fixed on a different kind of battlefield, the unforgiving, frozen wasteland of Antarctica. The South Pole had already been reached by Roald Amundsen in 1911, and tragically by Robert Falcon Scott shortly after. The prize of being the first to the pole was gone. But Shackleton, a man of relentless ambition and undeniable charisma, visioned a new, even more daring challenge. He proposed the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. The goal was unprecedented: to cross the entire Antarctic continent on foot, from sea to sea, passing through the South Pole. To achieve this, Shackleton purchased a specialized ship, a wooden barkentine built in Norway, originally named Polaris. Shackleton renamed her Endurance, inspired by his family motto, Fortitudine vincimos, by endurance we conquer. He placed an advertisement in the newspapers that supposedly read, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in event of success." Whether the ad was real or a myth that grew over time, the response was overwhelming. Over 5,000 men applied. Shackleton meticulously selected a crew of 27 men, a diverse group of sailors, scientists, a photographer named Frank Hurley, and a tough, experienced second-in-command, Frank Wild. In August 1914, just as the guns of World War I began to fire across Europe, the Endurance set sail from England. Shackleton had offered his ship and crew to the British government for the war effort, but the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, sent a one-word telegram in reply: proceed. They sailed south, away from the warmth of the known world, toward the Weddell Sea, a treacherous body of water notorious for its shifting, deadly pack ice. They were sailing straight into the most hostile environment on Earth. Chapter 2, The Weddell Sea's Grip. By December 1914, the Endurance had reached the Weddell Sea. The conditions were exceptionally bad that year. The ocean was not open water, but a vast, grinding puzzle of pack ice. For weeks, the ship battled through the frozen labyrinth. The crew used the ship's powerful steam engines to ram through the ice, while men leaned over the bow with long poles, physically pushing the heavy floes away from the wooden hull. It was exhausting, freezing work. Despite their best efforts, the ice grew thicker and more tightly packed as the Antarctic summer faded into autumn. On 1840 faller, for 5 for my 40 Souther, for 5 for my 40 Souther, effectively cementing the ship in place. They were trapped. Our position on the morning of the 19th was latitude 76 degrees 34 south. Shackleton later wrote, "The ship was firmly beset." The crew spent the next several months hoping that a shift in the wind would break the ice apart and free them. But as the temperature plummeted and the long, dark Antarctic winter set in, the ocean froze solid for millions of square miles around them. The Endurance was no longer a ship sailing on an ocean. It was a wooden station embedded in a frozen, drifting continent. Shackleton, affectionately called the boss by his men, recognized the psychological danger of their situation. He immediately established a strict routine to keep morale high. They played football on the ice, hosted evening sing-alongs, raced their sled dogs, and maintained their scientific observations. The ship, though trapped, became a cozy, warm refuge against the howling blizzards outside. But beneath them, the ice was constantly shifting, groaning, and building pressure. It was only a matter of time before the frozen sea decided to flex its muscles. Chapter 3. The Death of the Endurance. In September 1915, the Antarctic spring arrived, bringing sunlight back to the Weddell Sea. However, the changing temperatures caused the vast ice floes to break apart and smash into one another with unimaginable force. The Endurance became a casualty of this slow, grounding geological warfare. Massive blocks of ice, some weighing thousands of tons, began to press against the ship's wooden hull. The ship groaned and shrieked in protest. The crew worked desperately to pump water out of the bilge, but the pressure was too immense. The ice bent the ship's timbers, snapping thick beams like matchsticks. On October 27, 1915, the ice finally pierced the hull. Water poured in. The ship was lifted up and twisted by the sheer force of the frozen ocean. Shackleton stood on the deck, looking at the twisted, dying vessel. He knew the fight to save her was over. He turned to his men and calmly gave the order that every sailor dreads. "She is going, boys. It is time to get off." The crew evacuated onto the floating ice, taking with them the sled dogs, limited provisions, 3 small wooden lifeboats, and their cold weather gear. They watched in silent heartbreak as the Endurance was slowly crushed, her masts snapping and her hull splintering. Weeks later, she slipped beneath the ice forever, leaving 20 men stranded on a floating piece of ice in the middle of nowhere, thousands of miles from human civilization. Shackleton gathered his men. His dream of crossing the continent was dead. He looked at the faces of his crew and established a new, singular goal. "Ship and stores have gone," he told them. "So now we will go home." Chapter 4. Ocean Camp and Patience Camp. Survival on the pack ice was an exercise in extreme misery. The men established what they called Ocean Camp, a cluster of canvas tents pitched directly on the frozen sea. The ice beneath them was constantly drifting, carrying them further away from land. Their diet consisted of whatever they could hunt, primarily penguins and seals. Blubber was used not only for food, but as fuel to melt ice for drinking water and to keep their small stoves burning. The ice was a treacherous landscape. It could split open at any moment, plunging a man into the freezing, dark ocean below. Sled dogs, which had become beloved companions to the men, had to be tragically put down one by one as the food supply dwindled. It was a devastating blow to the crew's morale. After a failed attempt to march across the ice flagging their heavy lifeboats, they established a second, smaller camp named Patience Camp. For months, they drifted. They were entirely at the mercy of the wind and the ocean currents. As April 1, 1916 approached, the floe they were living on began to break apart beneath them. The ocean was finally opening up, but they were running out of solid ground. If they did not take to the small lifeboats soon, they would be swallowed by the sea. On the 9th in April, the ice split directly through the center of their camp. Shackleton gave the order. The men launched the 3 small, open lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, into the freezing, turbulent waters of the Weddell Sea. Chapter 5. The Desperate Escape to Elephant Island. The journey in the lifeboats was a nightmare of cold, dehydration, and exhaustion. The men rowed constantly, trying to navigate through a maze of crashing ice floes. Sea spray froze instantly on their clothes and their beards. They suffered from frostbite, seasickness, and dysentery. They were aiming for a small, desolate speck of land called Elephant Island. For 7 days, they battled monstrous waves and freezing gales. The men were operating on the absolute limit of human endurance. Many were hallucinating. Others were slipping into a comatose state of hypothermia. Finally, on the 15th of April, 1916, they spotted the rocky cliffs of Elephant Island. They dragged boats onto a narrow, pebble beach. It was the first time they had stood on solid ground in 497 days. Some men fell to their knees in wet. Others readily drank from a glacial stream. But their salvation was an illusion. Elephant Island was entirely uninhabited, far from any shipping lanes, and blasted by constant hurricane-force winds. Nobody knew they were there. If they stayed on the island, they would slowly starve to death. Shackleton realized that rescue would not come to them. They had to go to it. He hatched a plan so daring, it bordered on suicidal. He would take a small crew in the largest of the lifeboats, the 22.5-foot James Caird, and sail across the Southern Ocean to the whaling stations on South Georgia Island. It was a journey of 800 miles across the Drake Passage, known as the most violent, dangerous stretch of ocean on the planet. Chapter 6. The voyage the James Caird Shackleton selected 5 men to accompany him: Frank Worsley, the brilliant navigator; Tom Crean, a tough-as-nails Irish seaman; Harry McNish, carpenter, who raised the sides of the boat for better protection; John Vincent, and Timothy McCarthy. They left the remaining 22 men on Elephant Island under the command of Frank Wild, turning 2 of the lifeboats upside down to create a makeshift hut. Shackleton promised he would return for them. On the 24th April 1916, the James Caird set sail. The journey was a master class in survival and navigation. The small boat was battered by rogue waves that towered 60 feet high. The men were constantly soaked, bailing water for their lives. Ice formed heavily on the sails and rigging, forcing the men to crawl out onto the freezing, pitching deck that chipped the ice away with axes so the boat would not capsize. Worsley, the navigator, had to calculate their position while balancing in a violently pitching boat, catching only fleeting glimpses of the sun through the thick storm clouds. If his calculations were off by even a fraction of a degree, they would miss South Georgia entirely and be swept out into the endless Atlantic Ocean, never to be seen again. For 16 agonizing days, they battled the Southern Ocean. They survived on meager rations, shivering in wet sleeping bags, drinking brackish water. Miraculously, on May 8, through the mist and the spray, they saw the black cliffs of South Georgia. Worsley's navigation had been flawless. But the ocean had one final test. A massive hurricane struck just as they approached the coast, threatening to smash the tiny boat against the rocks. They rode out the storm for 2 terrifying days, finally managing to steer the battered James Caird into a small, sheltered cove on the uninhabited southern coast of the island. They had made it. But the whaling stations, and their only hope of rescue, were on the northern coast. Chapter 7. The crossing of South Georgia. The James Caird was too damaged to sail around the island. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean had to leave the 3 weaker men behind with the boat and cross the interior of South Georgia on foot. It was a journey no human being had ever attempted. The interior of the island was a jagged, unmapped spine of glaciers, deep crevices, and towering, impassable peaks. With only a 50-foot rope, a carpenter's adze to use as an ice axe, and screws taken from the lifeboat driven into their boots for traction, the 3 men set out under the light of the moon. They climbed for 36 hours straight. They navigated treacherous ridges, nearly falling into hidden glacial chasms. At one point, trapped by a sheer drop and freezing fog, Shackleton realized they would freeze to death if they stayed on the ridge. He ordered his men to sit on coiled ropes, and together they blindly slid down the side of a mountain in the dark, plunging the thousands of feet, miraculously landing softly in a snowbank at the bottom. Exhausted, filthy, and operating on sheer willpower, they heard a sound that brought tears to their eyes, the morning whistle of the Stromness whaling station. They stumbled down the final waterfall and into the station. The Norwegian whalers, who knew of the Endurance and assumed the entire crew had perished years ago, were stunned. 3 ragged, terrifying figures had emerged from the impossible mountains, smelling of seal blubber and soot. Shackleton stepped forward. "My name is Shackleton," he said. The station manager, who had hosted Shackleton before the expedition began, wept. Chapter 8. The Rescue. Shackleton immediately organized a boat to pick up the 3 men waiting on the other side of South Georgia. But his mind was fixed on the 22 men still stranded on Elephant Island. Rescue was not easy. The Weddell Sea was still choked with ice. Shackleton organized 3 separate rescue attempts using ships loaned from various governments, but each time, the pack ice forced them to turn back. Finally, on the 3rd of August, 1916, over 4 months after Shackleton had left them, a Chilean steam tug named the Yelcho broke through the mist approaching Elephant Island. On the beach, Frank Wild and the remaining crew had survived on a diet of penguins huddled under the overturned lifeboats, suffering from frostbite and despair. Many had given up hope of ever seeing the boss again, but as the Yelcho approached, the men on the beat began to cheer frantically. Shackleton stood on the bow of the ship, counting the figures through his binoculars. "They are all there," he shouted hoarsely. "They are all there." In less than an hour, the entire crew was brought aboard the Yelcho, despite enduring nearly 2 years of the most hostile conditions imaginable. The crushing of their ship, starvation, freezing temperatures, and impossible ocean crossings. Not a single member of the 28-man crew had died. The Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition was a complete failure in its original goal. But as a story of leadership, resilience, and the sheer human will to survive, the saga of the Endurance remains one of the greatest true stories ever told. Sir Ernest Shackleton never crossed the continent, but he brought every single one of his men home alive.